My daughters are beautiful, soft-hearted little people. And like all beautiful, soft-hearted little people, they like kittens. I am not beautiful or soft-hearted. I'm old and angry, and I don't like kittens. You can see how this could create some conflict in our household, but eventually I broke down and decided that I'd cooperate. So to make this thing work, I cooked up a plan where the kids could still have kittens and I wouldn't have to have them roaming around my house. So I took them out into the wild. Somebody said they had some feral cats roaming around near their shed, and I found the feralest cats I could find. Cats that were sure to hate the indoors and be angry and scratchy and hostile in every way imaginable. The thinking being that then my kids won't like them that much, and the cats can sort of loom around the outside of the house, maybe chase off the occasional pest, and really not nuisance us in any way. So we went and we picked out the kittens, and they were kind of cute, I guess, if you're into that, which I'm not. And we gave them to the girls, and I have to admit it was a pretty tender moment to see them welcome these new little furry bundles of joy into their lives. And so we took the kittens home and we told the girls about responsibility and what they needed to do to take care of them and what they needed to do to orient the cats to their new house, especially since their new house was going to be outside of our home. The girls were so diligent and so attentive and so wanted to do a good job that they let them out to play, and the kittens both ran off. And in come both of my little girls, just sobbing and heartbroken, and all of a sudden, everything in my life as it pertained to those kittens changed. I suddenly wanted nothing more than to recover them to make my little girls happy. So we went and we looked and dug around, and all day I obsessed about where kittens might hide, and eventually we recovered both kittens and they never ran away again. But in the process of recovering the lost cats, I came to develop something of an affection for them. It's regrettable. It wasn't intentional. If I had it to do again, I think I could resist. But as it is, Luna and Sol are now a part of our lives, and I begrudgingly like them. But that's all it takes for those little weasels to figure out that they can get away with whatever they want. Because as soon as I started acting like I liked them at all, they just took over our house. But what happens is I get all set up and hunkered down for back-to-back football games, and then the cats want to cuddle. Not some other time. That is when they want to cuddle. And so they keep jumping up into my stuff, and it's absolutely horrible. And so I keep taking the cats and putting them down. But I like the cats, so I don't just fling them across the room. Well, they don't get the hint. And so every time I take the cats and put them down, they just wait a second, walk around, rub against my foot, and then jump back up. And I repeat this 20 times, again and again and again. But the thing is, I'm not nearly harsh enough, so they assume they can keep doing it, and they just keep coming back. If this story about cats makes any sense to you whatsoever, then the story we're going to look at in Acts chapter 5 is probably going to make sense to you too. Because this was a group of people who really believed that God was doing something in their midst, and no matter how many times they got told to knock it off and quit talking about it, they kept getting right back up and doing the thing that they'd just been told not to do again and again and again. And in this passage, we're going to see another account of the way the religious leaders of the day shoo the cats who were the early Christian church off of the couch and try to get them to knock it off. Did I stretch that analogy too far? Just a second. I'm going to check with the room. Oh wait, it's just me. Analogy stands. We're in Acts chapter 5, verses 17 through 26. In the passages right before this, a couple of people came and tried to swindle the church, and they weirdly died because of it. We don't know exactly what was going on there, and there's some contention about what the point of that account might be, but what we know for sure is that coming out of that incident, the early church didn't really skip a beat. They continued to experience the miraculous presence of God, people continued to be excited, and even though there was great threat of punishment from the religious establishment, they kept signing up to follow Christ, and the numbers of the people involved in the church grew, and miracles kept on happening, and that brings us to a set of miracles that were occurring at Solomon's Colonnade, which is a part of the temple complex. And of course, if anything that is happening in the name of Jesus is occurring near the temple complex, it won't be long, and we're going to hear from the religious establishment. That's where we pick it up in verse 17. Then the high priest and all his associates, who were members of the party of the Sadducees, were filled with jealousy. 18. They arrested the apostles and put them in the public jail. But during the night, an angel of the Lord opened the doors of the jail and brought them out. So this should be a little bit familiar to you. Back in chapter 4, Peter had just got done healing a guy who was crippled from birth, and that guy's jumping around and celebrating, and then along come the religious leaders and the temple guard. So it is here in the middle of Acts chapter 5. We're doing the exact same thing. Enthusiasm for Jesus and miraculous things have happened near the temple. The temple is a very sacred place reserved for the religious establishment, and they don't like this stuff going on. So they're going to come along with the power of the state in tow to use force to put an end to these ideas. Here, Luke gives us a little bit of insight into their motives, though. They're jealous. They hate that they have come out and used their official position and the power of the state to say, we denounced that thing that you believe in. It's wrong. Don't believe it anymore. But a lot of these people seem content to blow off their religious leaders. They're not listening to that instruction. Instead, they're following after these uneducated Galileans, hicks from the backwoods who never went to school, don't have any title, don't have any authority. They didn't go through the proper hoops. Those Sadducees had to go through years of training. They had to attend councils. They had to be scrutinized by their peers. There's a process for this. You don't just start saying religious things without going through a certain process. So they arrested the apostles and put them in the public jail. What we see here is yet another example of people responding very wrongly to the redemptive work of God throughout the Gospel of Luke and its sequel, the Book of Acts. But don't take my word for it. Enjoy this lightning fast list of examples. Number 1, the one I just mentioned in Acts chapter 4. Number 2, Luke 20, when Jesus out-teaches all the religious leaders and so they try to kill him. Number 3, in Luke 13, when Jesus heals on the Sabbath, and rather than being excited about somebody getting healed and seeing the work of God, the religious leaders decide that they should be grouchy about what day it happened on. Number 4, in Luke 11, when Jesus goes to eat with some Pharisees and they get mad that he didn't wash his hands properly beforehand, and then he teaches them a bunch of spiritual truths about the reality of God and the bigger points of the kingdom, and they can't really out-argue him, so they decide that they should just lay a trap for him and maybe kill him. Number 5, also in Luke 11, Jesus casts out some demons, and the religious leaders, rather than being excited that Jesus had just done something awesome for somebody else, instead decide to accuse Jesus of being in league with those demons. Number 6, Jesus casts out a bunch of demons, sends them into some pigs. Those pigs go running off a cliff, and rather than everyone being excited about the fact that the neighborhood demons got dealt with, they instead freak out, threaten Jesus, and tell him that they want him to get out of town. Number 7, Luke chapter 6, Jesus heals a guy who had a withered arm. It grows back in front of everybody, and rather than being excited about the fact that God had done this for this person who only had the use of one of his 2 arms, the religious leaders instead get upset that he did it on a Sunday and start conspiring, wondering to themselves what they might be able to do to him. Number 8, Luke chapter 5, Jesus calls a man out of a despised lifestyle, and rather than the Pharisees being excited that someone was reformed and living a life for God, they instead get mad that Jesus is hanging out with someone who used to be bad. Number 9, also in Luke chapter 5, Jesus allows someone to interrupt his speaking and heals the guy and forgives his sins, and rather than being excited that somebody got healed and their sins got forgiven, all of the religious leaders complain about Jesus' credentials and how it's none of his business to be offering forgiveness to anyone. Number 10, after doing a whole bunch of things that demonstrate that God is at work, Jesus goes to church, opens up the scroll from the book of Isaiah, reads the thing, and then talks about all of the promises that are there and says that these things are being fulfilled in your hearing, and associates himself with what God is going to do in that respect. Everybody gets really mad and responds to words they don't like by dragging him to a cliff face and trying to throw him off of it. There are plenty more examples, but there's 10 good ones that demonstrate a pattern here. In Luke and in Acts, the people who should be responding rightly to the work of God through Christ instead tend to get really grouchy about the whole thing and respond with aggression. What happens in verse 18, at least as it pertains to the disciples' response, really shouldn't be any surprise to anyone. Just a chapter earlier, when confronted with the same religious authorities, Peter and John told them, hey, thanks for the warning and for the imprisonment and everything, but we're going to go ahead and continue to do what God told us to do. He said say things, we're going to continue to say things. Would it be smart for us to listen to him or to you? And here we see that these are men of their word, and they're following through on exactly what they said they were going to do. It's also nice to see Peter's progress. The first time we found ourselves in an arresty kind of situation, Peter went crazy, got out a sword, tried to hack people's heads or ears off. But the last couple times that he's been confronted with this, he's imitated Christ, responded more like him, and we see progress again here, and that there's no account of him resisting or fighting back. He's got a bigger agenda here, and he's willing to roll with this. Things get weird in verse 19. But during the night, an angel of the Lord opened the doors of the jail and brought them out. Verse 20. Go stand in the temple courts, he said, and tell the people the full message of this new life. Let's take a second to look specifically at what the angel is saying. First, the angel says, go stand in the temple courts. And we're back to the persistent cat thing. So one time, the disciples went and did some miraculous stuff in the temple courts, and they got smacked down. Then a second time, they went and did miraculous stuff in the temple courts, and they got smacked down. Now they're just coming off of that second smackdown, and the angel lets them go and says, go right back to the place where you were before, and implicitly, I think the assumption would be you're going to get smacked down again. Peter and the disciples have been talking about the big picture, historical, theological, redemptive narrative of this whole thing throughout their entire ministry so far. But now it seems like they're being prompted to bring this thing down to a more personal and devotional level where people can understand what it looks like for them as an individual to walk with Christ. Verse 21, at daybreak they entered the temple courts as they had been told and began to teach the people. When the high priest and his associates arrived, they called together the Sanhedrin, the full assembly of the elders of Israel, and sent to the jail for the apostles. Well, this is kind of fun, isn't it? It's enjoyable to see people who abuse their power get embarrassed. And that's what's about to happen. Verse 22. But on arriving at the jail, the officers did not find them there, so they went back and reported. We found the jail securely locked with the guards standing at the doors, but when we opened them, we found no one inside. On hearing this report, the captain of the temple guard and the chief priests were puzzled, wondering what would come of this. Okay, a couple of things. First of all, these religious leaders seem to be awful at managing detainees. They try to kill people and they don't stay dead. They arrest people and they don't stay arrested. This just isn't reflecting on them very well. Additionally, the account makes it clear that the guards were still there. Nobody had really noticed this thing occurring, just the disciples were under lock and key, and now they're back at the temple courts, teaching again, like those persistent cats. It's also interesting that in verse 24, we see that instead of asking the natural, how did this happen question, they instead most immediately wonder, what's going to come of this? They know this looks terrible for them, and maybe a few of them are even afraid that something supernatural is backing this new movement and these disciples who they just can't seem to get rid of. Verse 25, then someone came and said, look, the men you put in jail are standing in the temple courts teaching the people. At that, the captain went with his officers and brought the apostles. They didn't use force because they feared that the people would stone them. This is getting comical. The disciples can't be shooed away, and the enormous iron fist of power wielded by this very, very important religious establishment doesn't seem so iron-fisty or powerful all of a sudden because they're afraid to even go repeat their simple arrest. And the disciples are happy to oblige. No more swords, no more fighting back. They're happy to go along with this, I believe, because they understand that God was presenting them with this opportunity in front of the highest court of the land to get to explain the truth about what God was trying to accomplish through the redemptive work of Christ and the Holy Spirit. So I'll offer just a couple of quick summary points here before we wrap up. First of all, just like in the last passage, here again we see a God who is insistent on seeing through his redemptive plans. Second, that persistent cat thing we've been talking about isn't just a comment on the character of the disciples and their willingness to stick with it no matter what. I mean, that's great. They definitely deserve applause for that. I'm not sure I would ever have that kind of courage. But more so, I think we see an agenda on the part of God to push the Jewish leadership to make a decision. Are you going to ultimately and completely reject Jesus and the work that God is doing through him, or will you reconsider? Third, as I just alluded to, the disciples deserve credit for standing in and taking a whole bunch of punches here. This call to obedience is something that happened supernaturally for them and more generally probably for people who identify as Christians today, but I think the call is the same. Sometimes it might be a little bit personally costly, expensive even, to follow Christ, and these guys are a great example of what it looks like to handle that the right way. Next time around, we're going to look at a fascinating evolution in this ongoing tense dialogue between the religious leadership and Peter. And through that, I think we'll get more of a sense of where this entire conflict is headed. If you haven't subscribed yet to the 10-Minute Bible Hour, I don't know, you should probably subscribe. That's good for now. I'm Matt Whitman. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour. We will do this again in a week.